Well, did you miss me last week?
I did.
Somebody told me you looked lonely up here.
Well, I mean, the space looked lonely. I don't know if there was loneliness in my eyes or what, but what gave him that impression? But
Loneliness in your heart is what I was thinking.
probably reflected in my eyes.
Okay. Well, I missed you last week. But I had a good visit with Don Hasselman last week and went to worship with him in Medill, Oklahoma. And Glenn Colley happened to be there, which it's been so long since he was here that most of you may not remember him. But he came and spoke here probably 04, 05. Yeah. That it was a long time ago that we had them here for a kind of a weekend marriage presentation. So it was, and he said he remembered me, but I don't know. He knows a lot more people than I know. So, but you probably, so I've seen that guy before. I saw him on a poster in the post office. But anyway, but it was good to see him and good to see Don Hasselman. So you got busy last week, I hear, and covered.
We just flew through ground, man.
You covered a lot of ground. Okay, so let it be known then that it's not me that goes slow. Always, not always me that goes slow. Let's say that. Okay, so is there anything you want to do as a review of last week before we jump into verse 12?
Not necessarily, other than that verse right there. Therefore, you're no longer a slave, but a son. If a son, then an heir through God. Because what Paul's he's gonna start getting didactic, fancy word for he's gonna start teaching here. He's gonna start bringing out his rabbinical style of teaching when he says, hey, let's start opening the Old Testament and looking at what we're an heir to, how we are become an heir, what are we heirs from, and how the Judaizers are different. And so, verse 7 says, therefore you're no longer a slave, but a son, and if not a son, then you're an heir through God. Well, what are we heirs? How are we heirs? And he's going to flesh that out. And what's the difference between our sonship and essentially what Paul will say the sonship of the Judaizers is?
And it's interesting, and this is just something that came to mind. I don't know that I'll find it, but we only know what we know about the Judaizers based on what Paul is refuting. We don't have a description of the Judaizers, or we don't have an official title of what a Judaizer was, and these are the people that were them, and here's what they did, and here's what they taught, and what they believed. So we kind of have to go through what Paul is teaching about. But just this verse here, and your comment on it, made me think about a time that Jesus was speaking to a group of Pharisees, I suppose, and they made the statement that we are descendants of Abraham, and we have never been. What did they say they'd never been? We have never been slaves, which first of all is false, because remember the whole Egypt thing. They were. They'd been slaves, but how would when you think, especially in chapter 4 and some of the things hopefully we'll get to tonight if I'll stop talking, how would those things sit on the ears or in the hearts of these Judaizers? And when Paul says you're no longer a slave, whoa, wait a minute, you're calling us slaves? We've never been slaves to anybody. That was the attitude they had about who they were as God's people. We're God's people. We can't be slaves. That's ridiculous. Well, they're kind of slaves, even under the Roman law and everything. So, as Paul begins this didactic portion of what he's doing, where he really is going to start making some pretty serious arguments and laying down some logical comments and statements about why his position is right. He's really now laying it to these Judaizers and kind of drawing that line in the sand of you're going to have to defend your position against Paul, and defending your position against Paul is going to be difficult to do. Chuck.
Kind of ironic, the Jews were looking for the descendant of David to come and to restore them, you know. So why would they be looking for somebody to restore them if they wasn't under the thumb of somebody right now, you know?
Yeah. Right. It's well, yeah, I don't have anything to add to that. The passage I was thinking of, it's in John chapter 8. So John chapter 8, verse 32, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. When they answered and said, we are Abraham's offspring and have never yet been enslaved to anyone. How is it that you say you should become free? And so Paul, as he is making this case to these Judaizers that you're going into slavery if you follow them, and the Judaizers would be saying, wait a minute, we're the free ones here. We're not enslaving anybody. We are by definition free because we are Jews. And Paul is saying, no, if you're following the law, you're slaves. And so he's really making that distinction, drawing that line in the sand. Okay, anything we should go forward before we only make it through 3 verses tonight. All right. Here we go. All right. Galatians 4:12-20.
I beg of you, brethren, become as I am, for I also have become as you are. You have done me no wrong, but you know that it was because of a bodily illness that I preached the gospel to you the first time. And that which was a trial to you in my bodily condition you did not despise or loathe, but you received me as an angel of God, as Christ Jesus himself.
Do you want to stop there, or do you want to go on?
I don't know. I was going to leave it up to you.
Well, we got comments here.
Sure. Yeah.
They can't see them, but we can. All right. So go ahead.
Most of and I just did that for every slide because when you weren't here, I figured we'd make it a little further. So, but when we talked about this a little bit last week, but Paul says, "Become as I am," and I believe what he means by that is 2 things. One, become as I am consistent. I am consistent in my faith. As I've begun this work, I will end this work. I've begun in the Spirit, I'm going to continue in the Spirit. At chapter 3, they says, have you begun in the Spirit to be changed over to the flesh now? So Paul is saying, be consistent in your faith, but also be, freed, I guess. I had another word. I think it was liberty or something like that. In my liberty. Become as I am in my liberty to the law. Yeah. Because, again, the 2 things he's calling them back to is you've started in the Spirit, continue in the Spirit. I have been freed from the law because of what Christ did, and you should be free from the law for what Christ did. And then that second part, for I also have become as you are, I think is the 1 Corinthians 9, it might be 2 Corinthians 9, where Paul says, I become all things to all men that I might save some, is that while he was there, Paul became as they were in order to reach them, in order to bring them into the house. And now they're trying to become Jews, which Paul said, I don't even try to live like a Jew anymore. As I am now is not in Jewishness under the law, as I want you to be is not under Jewishness in the law either. And I think that is his appeal. He says next, you have done me no wrong, which we didn't talk too much about last week. But as we continue through this next section here, there's going to be a heavy emphasis on what I wanted to bring out, was the fact that Paul says, you have done me no wrong. And what I think Paul is doing is he's saying, this isn't a personal argument. Right. It's not personal to me. It's not about me and my feelings. When he starts his letter off, he says, if anyone preaches to you a different gospel, let him be accursed. And, we don't normally use those terms, but it could be stated another way that we don't often like to say, in condemnation and damnation, of let them be condemned. That is not good for this teaching to be among you. And then in chapter 3, he says, you foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? Where have you gone? How have you run away from the truth? And Paul is using strong language and an emotional argument, and that's kind of what it's been. Well, obviously there's been logic and the law and all of these things that he brings in, but part of this letter is an emotional appeal to say, hey, and it's summed up right here in verse 12, it's not about my feelings have been hurt. It's about you've wandered from the truth. And so, yes, it's not that I want you to love and respect me because I want to be loved and respected. I want you to love and respect the gospel and the truth and what is true. And that doesn't need to be, I would say, reciprocated or shown to me. And that's exactly the opposite of what the Judaizers will say here in the next couple of verses is they teach you so that you will love them and respect them and honor them and say, okay, well, teacher, how can I do the law better? That they kind of become the Pharisee / the rabbi in that instance, because it's like, okay, well, I need to now, they teach me to observe the law. Well, I need to ask them how I can observe the law better. And they are the gatekeepers to how well I'm serving the law, kind of a thing. And I think that's what he'll say here coming up. But Paul's attitude is different than that, because he says, it's not about me, it's not about my personal stake here, it's about my love for you, not about my own reputation or how much you love me in return. It's about your souls that are at stake from walking away from the gospel.
Right. I think you make a good point. It is personal because of his love for them, and it would hurt him from the standpoint of him being sad and him being hurt because of their leaving the gospel. But they are not dishonoring him in some way. They are not making he's not saying I'm doing this because you're hurting my numbers here, right? If you leave the gospel I brought to you, then that makes me look bad. That's not the argument that he's making. The Judaizers will make that argument. They'll say if you leave the gospel, then you are declaring you can't be our brothers, or you can't be in fellowship with us, and so we're going to guilt you into following our way of doing things because we want to have some control or rule over you. Paul makes his argument on love, not on a personal attack. Chuck?
Well, he says, I can't remember where it's at, but he says, that if he could, he would be condemned just to make sure that all of them are not condemned. I'm paraphrasing that.
Romans 9? Yeah.
Romans 10 or
Romans.
I think Romans 9:1. Yeah, Romans 9:3. For I wish I could that myself were accursed, separated from Christ for the sake of my brethren, my kinsmen according to the flesh.
Yeah. And so Paul does take that. Paul obviously pours himself into his ministry to the extent that he even chooses not to marry and in a sense is married to his work because he takes it so seriously, and so he is very emotionally bound up in it, but at the same time he realizes that a rejection of what he is preaching is not a rejection of him, it's a rejection of Christ, and so he is able to remove himself from that argument to the extent that he could say, this isn't about me, this is about my love for you and presenting the gospel to you, so that you can become as I am. And he makes that case. I think he takes very similar arguments, in letter to the 1 Corinthians. Maybe it's 2 Corinthians I'm thinking of, 2 Corinthians chapter 5, when he makes an emotional appeal there as well. We are ambassadors for Christ. Verse 14, 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 14, the love of Christ controls us. If we are, the verse before that, verse 13, if we are beside ourselves, it is for God. If we are of sound mind, it is for you. So he's making these emotional appeals, but it always goes back to his love for them and his love for the gospel, and the marriage of those two things together is what drives him to preach so vehemently in favor of the truth. Not because he wants to control them, not because he wants to lord it over them, not because he wants to have their accolades, but because he wants to see them saved, and that's the bottom line. There you go. I think we've covered that section.
Well,
Go ahead.
As he's continuing on here, one of the things that I have at the end of this section is the slide that says, I preached to you because of a bodily illness. Now, what does that mean exactly? Most of the people would say that this is interpreted as Paul ended up in Galatia, sort of, not in the same vein, but similarly, kind of, I don't know. I was going to try to make a comparison to the Macedonian call, where he's like, hey, don't go there and go here. But it's not necessarily something directed specifically by God, such as a message like that. But some say that because he was ill, he went to this region because of his illness of some kind, whatever that meant. Now, it could either be he was in the region and he got ill while he was there, so he stayed and preached, or that he was out of the region, gets sick, and says, hey, I can go over to the Galatian area, and they have great healers. They're, a great place where I can rest and be recovered or something. There's lots of different speculation on this. What his condition was, they will say, you will, if I were there, you would pluck out your own eyes for me. In the next section, at the end of the letter, he says, I write to you with such big letters. So some people think he had malaria or an eye condition or a malariac, I don't know if that's a word, a malaric eye condition. His malaria got so bad that it was infecting his eyes or something. But he has a bodily illness, and to them, that in the Roman day and age, that was something to be avoided. But Paul says that, I preach the gospel to you in this trial. You did not despise or loathe it, but you accepted and received and loved and cherished and were hospitable to me and received the doctrine of Christ. And no matter what his condition was, the ultimate purpose is the gospel was preached to them. They received it, even though the messenger wasn't the knight on the shining steed saying, follow me and we'll win the war. It was this sick old man, well, I guess he's not old, but this sick man with some sort of condition that they had to struggle with. And there were even times that said that, I don't know. That's too deep into the rabbit hole. Some people think that the scales from his eyes, when they fall off at his conversion, and this illness of his eyes could potentially, I don't know. But anyways, all that to say, Paul preaches to them because of the bodily illness. He's preaching to them, and even though that the messenger wasn't this powerful, dynamic, strong man, even though he was weak and sick at that time, they still received the gospel with love. And
I think one other scenario I think that's worth mentioning is, Paul at one point says, I bear in my body the marks of my service, and so he has visible effects of the things that he has suffered as a missionary when he's been beaten and stoned and those kind of things. And it could be that his eyesight is a condition of, if you take some rocks to the head, there's a possibility that your eyes are damaged or that your vision is damaged as a result of that. And I think that could be a possibility there as well, not to mention the scarring and the disfigurement that may come along from those things. And so when Paul is with them and they see the effects of those beatings and stonings upon his body, and what his body looks like, and the fact that it has affected his vision in some way, if that's what he's talking about, then they are not despising or loathing him, but showing compassion upon him as a sign of respect for what he has been through because of his service. Sam.
So Paul wasn't preaching a modern prosperity gospel, calling them to be like him?
Joel Osteen and Paul probably would not have been on the same stage preaching together. I would imagine, yeah. So it's not a health and wealth gospel for sure, because Paul struggled with health and with wealth. I think we have the evidence of that through his writings. So, yeah,
he had to work.
He was making tents and receiving donations to continue his ministry. So, yeah, good segue there. All right.
Where then is the sense of blessing you had? For I bear you witness that if possible you would have plucked out your eyes and given them to me. So have I become your enemy by telling you the truth? They eagerly seek you, not commendably, but they wish to shut you out so that you will seek them. But it is good always to be eagerly sought in a commendable manner, and not only when I am present with you, my children, with whom I am again in labor until Christ is formed in you, but I could wish to be present with you now and to change my tone, for I am perplexed about you.
So that I like the question that you posed here.
Well, so,
Does-
Paul, he says, just a second, I'm on the wrong slide. So the next thing that he says, he kind of addressed the eye plucking out thing, which is weird. Some people may say that is just instead of hyperbole, but also sort of like it's their the first century way of saying you'd give you'd have given me the shirt off of your back. I mean and so that's why some people say, well, it had nothing to do with his eyes, and his bodily ailment was actually this. And so regardless of what that is part of what Paul is saying here is your love for me was so tender, so affectionate that you were willing to do this. But verse 16 says, so I become your enemy by telling you the truth. And I think the question is this for each one of us. Well, there's multiple questions, but the one that the easiest one, I guess, to answer is, does the truth make enemies?
Jesus said he would set, father against son and mother against daughter and household against, yeah.
Okay, so the question, the follow-up
But he
questions to that-
also said the truth will make you free.
Yeah. The follow-up question to this is, when the truth hurts for me, am I an enemy maker or someone that owns up to the fact that I have failed, or that the truth is something that I don't like?
The truth only sets you free when you accept it. If you argue against it, Paul at his one of his conversion accounts, he records that Jesus' words. Jesus said to him, "How long will you kick against the goad?" And it's that picture of a cow or a goat or a sheep or something kicking against the prod that's trying to lead it in the right direction. And so Christ had been prodding Paul, poking him to go the right direction, and Paul kept kicking against it. And finally Christ shows up and says, how long are you going to reject the truth? How long are you going to continue to deny what you know to be true? And he's finally confronted with that truth that he can't deny in the form of Jesus himself. And so truth will imprison those who reject it, but it will free those who accept it. And so it's a valid question. Are we enemies, or are we made enemies by the truth, or are we made children by the truth?
Well, and I think that was the first avenue, I guess, of where my thoughts led with this is when I am confronted with truth, how do I respond? Mm-hmm. Am I one of the ones that hunkers down and says, well, or I guess from a different light, when people try to come and tell me the truth, is that difficult for them because I can't handle it? And then, you can't handle the truth is a saying that people use these days. And sometimes it might be true in our own lives. Are we so prideful? So do we lash back at people that try to help us and tell us the truth even when it hurts? And I guess the other thing was also the opposite side of that coin was, if we have the truth and we need to tell someone, are we those that compromise the truth or compromise the situation or dumb down the things that need to be said in order to keep the peace and keep the relationship? Because sometimes the truth makes enemies, and as people, we would rather please people and have great friendships and relationships rather than tell people the truth. And so those were the two sides of the coin for me was, can I accept truth, and am I courageous enough to tell the truth when it's necessary? And I think those are all good questions to ask ourselves.
Yep.
There was a time in Paul's life when the enemy made him, the truth made an enemy of him.
Right.
He was fighting against the truth. And I think it's kind of ironic that in order to hear the truth, he had to be blind.
Yeah.
Had to be humbled before he could accept the reality. But yeah.
You listen better when you can't see it.
So I guess continuing forward, verse 17 says, we talked about this a little bit, they eagerly seek you, not commendably, but they wish to shut you out so that you will seek them. And verse 18 says, at least in the NASB, which is a mouthful as I was trying to read it, but it is good always to be eagerly sought in a commendable manner. And so I looked at a couple different other translations just to kind of help understand what this is trying to say. The NIV says, it is fine to be zealous, provided the purpose is good. And so I don't necessarily know how the NSB and the NIV, how they kind of mesh together, but the ESV is always good to be made much of, for a good purpose, but it is good to be zealous in a good thing always. Are the other different ways that I think the other different ways that the translations are used, but I think it's all about the idea that these people that are speaking, they are speaking to people so that they will get honor, that they will get glory, that you will seek us, you will be eagerly sought, you will be zealous for me, although if it's not good, that's not a good thing to be zealous about. And I just kind of fumbled over that as I was saying it, but the idea is if you're very zealous for what someone is saying, if they're saying truth, that's awesome, that's amazing. Be fired up, be amped up, be made much of. Say, hey, you're a great teacher because you're teaching the truth. But if they're not teaching the truth, don't be amped up, don't be zealous, don't be saying you're a great teacher of the truth if it's not the truth. And so I think verse 18, if you'll go to the next slide, I think that what he's addressing there is the fact that people have itching ears, and that if you'll be led away into whatever sounds good, and yes, I don't know if law-keeping sounds good all of the time, but at least to these Galatian people, it was something that they followed after eagerly. And I think what Paul is saying is you were zealous for this. They were saying, hey, be more spiritual by becoming like Jews. Come more like Christ. And by imitating Christ, that means keeping all of the festivals. Because, Paul will later say, imitate me as I imitate Christ. Well, when Christ was on this earth, he fulfilled the law. He did all the ceremonies. He did all the festivals. He did all these things. And so it is a logical conclusion that they were zealous for what these people were teaching because it felt like they could be closer to God. But I think what Paul is saying there, specifically in verse 18, is that if you teach the truth, and if someone is teaching the truth, it is good to eagerly seek the teaching and even, in a sense, a little bit of the sense, the teacher that is teaching you that so that he can continue to bring forth truth. But I don't know if all of that made sense, but that was the first thought that I had when coming to verse 18.
Yeah, I like it. The idea of, Paul in the Philippian letter says that there were those who were preaching the gospel, hoping that by preaching the gospel they would somehow bring shame to Paul. Like they would, if they could get more followers, if they could do whatever. And Paul says, you know what, if they're preaching the gospel, I don't care why they're preaching it, as long as they're preaching the gospel. And so the bottom line is to do what is right, and to doing what is right is where our zeal should be, is where our where we should be seeking to do those good things. And so that's that commendable manner, doing it in a good purpose. And it makes me think, I don't know if this was a movie quote or something, but somebody, I remember the quote one time, if you can't be famous, be infamous. And because the idea is that as long as you're well known, that's the goal. And if you can't do it you can't become well known by doing something good, just do something bad so you can be well known. Well, that's kind of, have you watched anything on the internet lately? I mean, that's kind of the attitude that a lot of people take. I'm going to be well known for something. And so they do lots of silly and foolish things so that they can become well known. Well, they got their reward then. They're well known, but they're not good people. And so we want to be, it's that commendability, it's that good purpose that is the focus, that is the goal by which we do things.
The middle point that I had up there was Paul's condition. We talked about that, about he had a bodily illness of some kind. There's lots of speculation. If you ever want to just fall into a rabbit hole, you can look up at what was Paul's illness. And there'll be people that will throw out random things, and it doesn't necessarily, whatever's in the text is in the text, and beyond that is speculation. But Paul has some sort of bodily illness. He's preaching to them. Paul's love for them. Paul says, again, as we read in Romans 9, that I wish I would be cut off for you guys to know the truth. But Paul also says here that it's not about me. It's not about that you have, verse 12, you have done me no wrong. It's not about my reputation, my honor, my respect. It's that I love you so much that you have left the gospel. And then finally, his labor, which I use that term because that's exactly what Paul describes in verse 19. My children with whom I am again in labor. And so Paul says, my little children, and then like this motherly, fatherly figure kind of a thing. I am in labor again, interesting metaphors Paul is using here. I am in labor again until Christ is formed in you. So I heard somebody, it was one preacher said, I bet you didn't, you couldn't find Christmas in Galatians 4, but here it is. So you are birthing Christ within you, which is an interesting and kind of an odd turn of phrase, but that's kind of what Paul is saying, is that my little children with whom I am again in labor, I'm happy to labor over this again so that you can come to the gospel, because you've wandered so far away that there's no longer any Christ in it. It's been watered down so much that it's about you and your works and your performance and your keeping of the law, and Christ is no longer within your lives. And I have to labor again so that Christ can be reformed in you, which is just an interesting metaphor. And at the very end there, he says, I wish I could change my tone, which, again, it's like the text messages. You never know. You can get a text message from somebody and be like, oh, man, they must be pretty furious with me. And you come back later, and it's like, well, they were just making a joke or something, or whatever. But Paul is saying, I wish I could be present, because my tone is very serious. It's very heavy. It's very difficult because you guys have left the path.
And it could be easy to, to address that last point, it is much more easier to read somebody's intent if you are having an actual conversation with them. You can see their body language, you can hear their tone, versus the words written on the page, where it can be sometimes easier to misunderstand what is being said. And so Paul wishes that he could be present with them so that they could see the love in his eyes, they could hear the emotion in his voice, and know that this is not a personal attack, that this is that there's a sincere desire for them to know the truth. And so that only makes sense, and I think we would relate to that in a very personal way if we needed to address something with a friend. So much better to do that not through a text message than to to be able to be present with them personally and say the things that need to be said. Chuck?
Setting, when you're sitting in your office or whatever, you get a phone call or a text or email or whatever, says when the boss says, come see me, then you start like, oh, what did I do?
Yeah.
What's this about?
Yeah.
You don't know the intent,
Yeah.
you're sitting there, you're trying to think of everything that you've done wrong instead of everything you've done right.
Yeah. Just clean out my desk now before I go see him. All right.
Well, but on the other hand, it'd be better to walk in there with the humble attitude of, okay, I don't know what I have done, than you're about ready to promote me, and you walk in there. It's like, but anyways, I thought that was awesome.
That's all right. Back to verse 19. That language it's the language of a mother laboring to give birth to her child, and that's the metaphor, the imagery that's being used. And the idea there is only when a child is fully formed and developed in the womb does labor bring forth joy. Does labor bring forth what a properly formed child? And if if it's premature labor or if it's premature birth, then that's not good. And so Paul is working. He is laboring to make sure that the proper thing is formed in the Galatian Christians. And because he sees them as his children in the flesh, or his children in the spirit. And so Paul would continue laboring until his children were formed into the image of Christ. And that is something that the law could never do. The law could never form within them the image of Christ. That's not the purpose of the law. That's not what the law is capable of doing. And if we ask the keeping a law to make us more Christ-like, we have missed it. We've missed it altogether. And so Paul is driving this home because what he longs for them more than anything is that they become like Christ. And he is not going to allow the Judaizers to co-opt them, to lead them astray, because what they're selling can never form in them what Paul wants to see them become, and that is to become Christ.
My final discussion question for this section was, what can you learn about making disciples from this passage? Well, a lot of things.
You answer it.
A lot of things. I mean, at least for me, the things that I
Yeah.
had learned was that, Paul calls it a labor, and I don't necessarily think that we don't want to run too far away with his metaphor because it's just one verse or so that he uses. But, making disciples is not about, oh, hey, just learn this and you're good. It is a continuous process of love, and making disciples takes devotion, it takes time, it takes attention, it takes relationship, and it takes continued follow-up on, hey, can we continue to get together on this, and how can we continue to learn what Christ is like and who Christ is and how Christ is being formed in us, and that discipleship can sometimes be discouraging because people sometimes don't get it, or they have this cool new idea and they run off on their own deal. And sometimes bringing people back takes a lot of attention, a lot of effort, a lot of love. And I'm sure there are lots and lots of other lessons and things we can pull out of this passage, but I think the main one was that discipleship takes time and love and attention.
You mentioned relationship, and he of course had a very close relationship with them. They considered him like an angel of Christ himself, said earlier. But based on that relationship, he was able to be bold and very direct about correcting error. We want to have that kind of relationship if we're going to have that kind of conversation, but he wasn't afraid to confront them with boldness.
And he did. And as much as he wanted to see them, as much as he wanted to protect and preserve that relationship that he had with them, he was unwilling to compromise the truth to do so. And so the relationship, boy, that was important to Paul, but even more important than the relationship was the truth. And he was going to preserve and protect the truth at all costs. And so even at the, the thing he didn't want to have happen was that relationship to be severed, but he would not give up the truth in order to keep it from being severed. I don't know if I'm saying that right.
It's also interesting to me that he said, it was bad enough for me to give birth to you once, now I'm going to give birth to you again.
That makes me think of Nicodemus with Jesus. Do I have to go through birth again as an adult? I don't know that. It was okay as an infant. I don't remember it, but I don't want it. Yeah. There you go. Okay.
Continue on.
Continue on.
We'll go all the
All
way
right.
through this. I didn't have anything to stop and talk
Okay.
about it, but it's all one allegory. Tell me, you who want to be under the law, do you not listen to the law? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by the bondwoman and one by the free one. But the son by the bondwoman was born according to the flesh, and the son by the free woman through the promise. This is allegorically speaking, for these women are two covenants, one proceeding from Mount Sinai, bearing children who are to be slaves. She is Hagar. Now this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free. She is our mother. For it is written, rejoice, barren woman, who does not bear. Break forth and shout, you who are not in labor. For more numerous are the children of the desolate than the one who has a husband. And you, brethren, like Isaac, are children of promise. But as at that time he who was born according to the flesh persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, so it is now also. But what does the Scripture say? Cast out the bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be an heir with the son of the free woman. So then, brethren, we are not children of a bondwoman, but of the free woman. So this is quite an interesting, fun allegory here. Do you want to go to your slide to kind of explain something?
So, and this is just, I don't think this necessarily even hits every comparison that is made in the allegory that we could draw out. I think we could get into some details and really kind of drive a lot of points home. But this gives kind of an overview of the point that Paul is trying to make. And so we have this comparison between Hagar, who was the bondwoman, and Sarah, who is the free woman. Now, if that's all we had, who is it that we want to be on the side of? We want to be the child of the free woman, not the child of the slave woman, because under law, if you were born to a slave woman, you were a slave yourself. And so who is it that the Judaizing teachers would identify with if we stop right there? Who would the Judaizing teacher say, oh, I see where he's going with this, and I got this one?
Mother Sarah,
Yeah, we are.
had many daughters.
There you go. Man. We are children of Sarah. I mean, by birth, that's who they are. That's who they would claim. They would automatically put themselves in the camp of we are children of the free woman because we're descendants of Abraham through Sarah. We know that Isaac and Jacob, and we've got our lineage, and we know what tribe, and we've got our documentation and all this. I mean, they're card-carrying members of the children of the free woman. And so Paul starts with this allegory, and he just lays them out. And so the children who are of the flesh, well, if you're relying on a fleshly relationship, Ishmael can make that case. He is a descendant of the flesh. And so that's who the Jews are. They are descendants because they're laying claim to being descendants of Abraham by the flesh. That's where we placed our hope. That's where we've placed our relationship, because we are the children. We are just fleshly descendants of Abraham. But it's Isaac that is the child of promise. He's the one that received the inheritance. Ishmael didn't get an inheritance. He got sent away. And so the child of the flesh doesn't get an inheritance, only the child of the promise does. And so now we start seeing a different distinction being made. The flesh leads into that discussion of the old covenant, but it's the child of promise. He's made that case that is the new covenant. And we saw that through the promises even made down through the prophets, Jeremiah and following. There is an earthly Jerusalem, and everything in the law revolved around that earthly Jerusalem. You had to go to the temple. You had to make the sacrifices. You had to get to the altar. The priests had to do the blessings. All of those things are tied to that earthly Jerusalem, but there is a heavenly Jerusalem, the Jerusalem that is above. Paul makes that case. And in the Hebrew letter, the Hebrew writer makes the case that the earthly things were shadows of those things that were the true appointments. And Christ has entered into that tabernacle made without hands in the new Jerusalem, in the heavenly Jerusalem. And so there's that comparison. Mount Sinai is the place where the law was delivered, and that should say Mount Zion, not on the right side there. Yeah, the right side. Mount Sinai, it should say, I'm typo on my part there, that should say Mount Zion is the heavenly covenant, and Mount Sinai represents the law. The children of the flesh through Hagar were expelled from the promise. They got removed from the camp, but the descendants of Isaac were the heirs of promise. They received that inheritance. And Paul has made that case repeatedly that it is through Christ that we are children of promise. And then finally, the Jews represent fleshly Israel, but Christians represent spiritual Israel. And so, again, there are probably other aspects of this that we could get into that show those contrasts between the descendants of Hagar versus the descendants of Sarah, and who is on the one side and who's on the other. But Paul lays it out that it is people who are descendants of the free woman are those that have accepted Christ, those that are the children of promise. And it is Christ that leads us to freedom, and it is the law that leads us into slavery. And he makes that case brilliantly. This is where Paul gets didactic, as you were saying earlier. It takes somebody who is, first of all, classically trained, as Paul was in the use of rhetoric. It takes somebody who is very well equipped to make a scriptural argument, as Paul would have been through his rabbinical training, and it takes somebody who is guided by the Holy Spirit to be able to make this theological argument, as Paul does.
It'd be kind of scary if preachers could do that.
Oh,
yeah. You remember that story about Esau and Jacob? Well, that means we're...
Yeah. This preacher can't. I don't know about that one.
No.
All right.
That's all Paul. But
okay.
My thought was, it says that... at the very verse 30, I guess this is kind of backwards here, which is a little bit. But verse 30 says, "Cast out the bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be an heir with the son of the free woman." And I think if you follow the metaphor, it's cast out the bondwoman and cast out the law. And I guess I tried to change this back up, not like cast out the law and have nothing to do with it, but cast out their interpretation of the law, cast out their righteous living based on the law. I did before we did the PowerPoint and whatever on the Google Drives, put in and the Judaizers, because I figured I wanted to make that distinction a little bit better, that it's not the law necessarily, because the law is holy, spiritual, and good. We've talked a lot about that. But cast out the Judaizers and their interpretation that this is how you become more righteous. And so this teaching, it is cast out the teachers, yes, but that also includes their teaching. And so those that would claim, hey, we can be descendants of Abraham according to the flesh because we're following the law and because we are fleshly, descendants of Abraham. As Jason was saying, that's Hagar. That's the Ishmaelic. I don't know what the
Ishmaelites.
The Ishmaelic view of Abraham being our father is because we keep the law. And so cast out that thought, cast out those teachers, cast out that idea, and respond in grace. Respond to grace and faith and live as a child of the Spirit of promise. This question, I didn't know how to refine it very much, but the thought was, which of these covenants does your heart follow? Now, on the surface, that's a really easy thing to say. Well, obviously, I don't follow the law. I'm not a child of, I'm not a descendant of the Jews, if it were. But to me, boiling these two down, it is a covenant of performance-based righteousness and a covenant that I am free because of the righteousness that Christ has imparted to me. And I know we talked a lot about that last week, and that was where, had we covered it all in 1 week, this is where we would have come to, is that too often, I think, in my own heart, I'm following after the idea that, and the three things that I talked about last week were fearful, insecure, and critical. And sometimes that's where my heart ends up with these, when I try to follow the covenant of my righteousness is based on how good I'm doing, and my relationship with Christ is based on how well I've been keeping all of these things. And that's the covenant my heart tries to follow, is that, hey, I feel like a good little Christian when I'm doing good little Christian things, and yet when I don't do good little Christian things, I feel like a failure and feel like God has no love for me and I'm no longer righteous. When my righteousness, if that's the way that I am constantly connecting with the covenant of God, I'm under the old covenant. I'm under this idea that I've got to do it and I've got to live up and complete all of these different things. And again, that's the difficulty, and I think that's the Paul and James argument, and all of the things that Paul talks about. If that's the way we react to grace, is that our righteousness is given to us, and it's nothing we do. That when we mess up under the law, it's not that we need to beat ourselves up and say, "Man, I'm not right with God anymore." We're right with God not because of what we have done and the evil that we have performed, but we're right before God because of what Christ has done. And so, again, I don't want to continue to beat a dead horse, but I think combining these two concepts that Paul says, should we sin more so that grace may abound, and the fact that when I sin and when I mess up, I feel like I'm under that I am no longer righteous before God. That I feel like I have messed it up and my relationship with God is broken and my relationship with Christ is no longer evident because I've done these horrible things. And there is such a case where you can turn your back on God, but my righteousness or lack thereof doesn't come from my own effort. And if I am engaging with Christ in that way, I am engaging with Christ like the Judaizers. If it's all, and I think that's why Paul had to say, let's not continue to sin. If our relationship is based on my righteousness comes from Jesus, no matter how well I'm doing or no matter, in a sense, how poorly I'm doing with keeping the law and doing all of these things. And yes, I think part of it is being transformed and walking in the light and doing these things, and we're going to be transformed. We are going to have a maturation of our faith. But if we start looking to this maturing of our faith and our walking in the light and our abilities to keep the law and do the good little Christian things, we've slowly started creeping over to the covenant of I can do this and I can do enough, or I can't do this and I haven't done enough, or I've done too badly. And again, I don't know if any of that resonates with you, but I find myself walking that path quite often of, man, I haven't been praying as much as I should be, or I haven't been reading the Word, or I've been doing too many of these things that I know that are sinful, and I've been not controlling my anger and not being able to do these things, and I feel like my righteousness reflects my relationship with God, which reflects my own performance, which my relationship and my righteousness are wholly incumbent upon Jesus and what He did and His righteousness. And again, I know that was a long rant, but I've run out of soap. So take it away, Jason.
Okay, I think a follow-up to that idea, I think, would be the idea of do we draw closer to Christ by keeping the law, or do we draw closer to Christ, and in drawing closer to Christ, that affects the way that we live, so that it changes who we are, so that our behaviors and our actions change. Do I change my behaviors and actions first and thereby draw closer to Christ, or do I draw closer to Christ, which changes my behaviors and actions? You know, sometimes we get the cart before the horse, I think sometimes, and it's easier to quantify the number of times I sin a day, or the number of times I pray a day, or the number of good things I do for other people a day. It's easier to quantify those things than it is to quantify, you know, am I drawing closer? Is my relationship with Christ growing? And so we focus on the outcomes more than we focus on what's really important, which is my relationship with Christ. Not that those other things aren't important. They are. We need to be working on those things, but those aren't the point. The point is the relationship.
Look at Paul's, right after his early Christian life, after his conversion, of how he changed, I mean, immediately, how he changed doing things.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, he was changing what he was doing, and doing that, he was, I don't know how to, by changing what he was doing, he was getting closer to Christ,
Yeah.
which was making him change even more.
Yeah.
You know? I mean, but he was just doing he just made an about face, basically.
Right. Yeah, and I think the thing that remained constant through that was his zeal. You know, Paul zealously followed the law to the point of persecuting Christians, and then when he made that big change, you know, when he was converted, he kept the zeal, but he changed the outlet. He changed what that zeal caused him to do, or caused him to look like. So, just a quick wrap up here with this thought. Paul used the law to refute the law. If you look at verse 23, chapter 4, verse 23, the son was by the bondwoman was according to the flesh, the son by the free woman through the promise. And so Isaac was born, Ishmael was born according to the flesh. Isaac, later on in verse 29, it says, at that time he was born according to the flesh, persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit. And so that idea of being born according to the promise and being born according to the Spirit is the same thing. So it was through the Spirit that Isaac, his birth was made manifest, his birth was made real, which kind of leads us, it's kind of a metaphor or simile for what, you know, even for the birth of Christ, that Christ's birth was through the Spirit. And so we have a similarity there, which is an interesting thing. And then if you go back and look at Genesis chapter 21, you see when Isaac was weaned, that Ishmael, it says, was Sarah saw him, Ishmael, mocking Isaac, and it could be the word mocking there could be the word playing, where Ishmael thought he was playing with his little brother who was, 15 years younger than him or something. But Sarah saw it as mocking. Sarah saw it as a bad thing. And so here, what is it that the Judaizers are trying to do? They're mocking the children of promise by telling them they need to be adherents to the law, that it's only the law that can make them righteous. And But what they should be doing is looking at the children of promise and saying, I want to be like them. I want to be made righteous by the promise, rather than being made righteous by the flesh. And so they were mocking the children of promise once again. Okay, we'll finish, or we'll start next week with a short little wrap up of chapter 4 before we jump into chapter 5. Thank you very much.